Nathan Carter, a brilliant black student, faces prejudice from professors like Charles Beckett and Evelyn Monroe in an elite math program. Defying expectations, he proves his genius by correcting Monroe's mistakes, excelling in challenges, and ultimately winning a national competition, forcing his detractors to acknowledge his undeniable talent and perseverance. Naomi Bennett, a black attorney, was wrongly arrested by officers Daniel Reese and Ethan Clark while reading in a park. The viral incident fueled outrage. Determined, she sued the police. Later, as a judge, she presided over their case, choosing justice over revenge, setting a powerful legal precedent. Nathan Carter sat quietly in the massive lecture hall of the University of Michigan, his fingers spinning a pen as he listened to Professor Evelyn Monroe's sharp voice fill the room. This wasn't just another calculus class. It was an arena where only the strongest mind survived. Today, Monroe wasn't just teaching. She was evaluating. A row of professors, including the infamous Charles Beckett, sat in the front, their cold gazes sweeping the room like silent judges. Beckett smirked when his eyes landed on Nathan, a black man in an advanced math class. "He won't last," he muttered to his colleague, convinced that Nathan's presence was nothing more than a mistake. But fate had other plans. When Monroe wrote a complex Laplace transformation on the board, Nathan immediately spotted a critical error. The entire class scrambled to copy the equation, oblivious of the mistake. He hesitated. Correcting Monroe, a professor known for eliminating weak students without mercy, would be a direct challenge to her authority. And with Beckett and his peers watching, the stakes were even higher. Yet, he couldn't ignore it. Raising his hand, he said firmly, "Professor, there's a mistake in the transformation." A suffocating silence took over the room. Monroe's cold smile deepened, a predator recognizing its prey. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice a trap laced with danger. The guest professors chuckled, waiting for Nathan to humiliate himself. But he met Monroe's gaze without flinching. "Yes, I'm sure." The waves of justice had begun to rise. Monroe's fingers tightened around her chalk as she turned back to the board, scanning the equation. Then she saw it. The mistake was real. She had miscalculated. And now, in front of her colleagues and students, she was exposed. Instead of admitting defeat, she handed Nathan the chalk. "Fix it," she ordered. Nathan stood calm and composed, rewriting the equation with effortless precision. The class watched in disbelief. Even Beckett, once smug, sat frozen in his seat. Nathan had done what no one dared. He had rewritten fate itself. But the real battle had yet to come, when Monroe challenged him to compete in the national math contest. Facing prodigies like Ryan Sinclair, Nathan didn't hesitate. "I'll do it." His journey wasn't just about winning. It was about proving that narrated stories of justice, emotional stories of resilience, and incredible stories of triumph could be more than just touching stories. They could be unraveled fates, a heartwarming story that justice was no longer just a whisper. It was a roar. Nathan Carter knew the odds were stacked against him. The moment he stepped into Professor Evelyn Monroe's classroom, he felt the weight of unspoken doubt. He was used to it, the stares, the whispers, the dismissive glances. But in the world of mathematics, numbers didn't care about prejudice. After proving his brilliance by correcting Monroe's mistake, Nathan had unknowingly set himself on a path that would test his limits. When she challenged him to compete in the national mathematics competition, he didn't waver. Monroe expected him to decline, but he had no intention of backing down. Charles Beckett, seated among the faculty, chuckled at the very thought of Nathan competing against the country's best minds. "This will be interesting," he murmured, already envisioning the downfall of a student he never believed belonged there. Nathan's determination turned into relentless preparation. Every morning, he arrived at the university library before anyone else, diving into textbooks that even graduate students avoided. His friend, Jake Miller, often found him surrounded by notes, deep in calculations that would make most people's heads spin. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Jake warned one evening. "I don't have a choice," Nathan replied without looking up. "I won't let them define me." The competition day arrived, held at the University of Pennsylvania. The room was filled with the nation's most elite students, many from MIT, Stanford, and Harvard. Among them stood Ryan Sinclair, a PhD candidate whose reputation preceded him. He was brilliant, methodical, and confident, the kind of competitor no one expected to falter. Nathan took his seat, ignoring the skeptical glances from students and faculty alike. Monroe sat among the judges, her expression unreadable. Beckett, however, wore his amusement plainly. He was certain Nathan would be crushed under pressure. The first problems appeared on the screen: complex integrals, multivariable calculus, abstract transformations. Competitors furrowed their brows, pen scratching furiously against paper. But Nathan was calm. Numbers flowed in his mind with absolute clarity. One by one, students began struggling. Even Sinclair slowed down, double-checking his work. But Nathan, he barely hesitated. As the final challenge was revealed, a problem designed to stump even the best, he set his pen down before anyone else. The judges reviewed his work. A hush fell over the room. Then the announcement came. Nathan Carter is the winner. The room erupted. Monroe sat still. Beckett's smirk vanished. And Nathan? He simply nodded, knowing this victory was only the beginning. Nathan Carter sat quietly in the lecture hall, flipping through his notes while his classmates exchanged hushed whispers around him. His victory at the National Mathematics Competition had sent ripples through the academic world, forcing those who once doubted him to reconsider their assumptions. Professor Evelyn Monroe entered the room as she always did, with a commanding presence. But today, something was different. The usual cold confidence in her eyes had been replaced by a fleeting hesitation as she scanned the room, stopping briefly at Nathan before continuing toward the lectern. Before she began the lesson, she cleared her throat. "Before we start, I want to say something," she announced. The room fell silent. Nathan Carter has proven that talent recognizes no boundaries. A simple statement, yet it carried more weight than any lesson she had ever given. Students exchanged glances, some in shock, others in silent admiration. Monroe had been known for her ruthlessness, for her unwavering belief that only the strongest belonged in her class. For her to acknowledge Nathan was an admission that he had shattered the barriers she once upheld. Charles Beckett, sitting in the front row, crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair. His face was devoid of its usual smugness, replaced instead with barely concealed frustration. He had watched Nathan's rise from a distance, certain that he would stumble. But Nathan had done the impossible. Not just winning the competition, but doing so with a brilliance that left no room for doubt. As Monroe turned back to board, the atmosphere in the room felt different. There was no longer the quiet condescension Nathan had once felt from his peers. No more stolen glances filled with skepticism. Instead, there was curiosity, respect, a newfound awareness that he was not just another student sitting among them. He was a student who had redefined what was possible. Jake Miller grinned from the seat next to him. "Well, that's a first," he whispered. "Never thought I'd hear Monroe admit she was wrong." Nathan simply nodded. He didn't need the recognition. He had never needed it. He had let his work speak for itself. And in doing so, he had forced an entire institution to listen. The lecture resumed, but the shift in the room was undeniable. The whispers had changed. The skepticism had been replaced by admiration. And Nathan Carter, the student who had once been overlooked, had become the standard by which excellence was measured. Nathan Carter sat in the dimly lit university library, his fingers skimming the pages of an advanced mathematics textbook. The national competition was behind him, but the effects of his victory still echoed through the academic halls. Professors, students, and even those who once dismissed him now spoke his name with a mix of admiration and disbelief. Yet, for Nathan, the true challenge had never been about proving himself to others. It was about proving to himself that he belonged. Across the table, Jake Miller leaned back in his chair, tossing a pencil between his fingers. "You know," he said, "I still can't believe you took Monroe head-on like that. And Beckett? He looked like he swallowed a lemon when they announced you won." Nathan smirked, but didn't look up from his notes. "It was never about them," he replied. "It was about the work." Jake sighed. "Yeah, well, the work just shook an entire department." Meanwhile, Professor Evelyn Monroe had been uncharacteristically quiet since the competition. She had carried herself with the same stern authority, but there was a shift, subtle but undeniable. She no longer dismissed Nathan in her usual cold manner, nor did she ignore him in the halls. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. Charles Beckett, however, was not so willing to change. His disdain had only grown stronger. The competition was supposed to prove that Nathan didn't belong, yet had done the opposite. As much as Beckett tried to downplay the results, the faculty and students had witnessed something remarkable. Nathan hadn't just won, he had rewritten expectations. One afternoon, as Nathan walked across campus, Beckett's voice cut through the air. "Carter," he called, his tone sharp. Nathan turned, meeting the professor's cold gaze. "One competition doesn't change the world," Beckett sneered. "You might have had your moment, but don't think for a second that this university is ready for someone like you at the top." Nathan's expression remained steady. He had heard words like these before, but they no longer had the same power over him. "I don't need a moment, Professor," he replied. "I just need the work." And that speaks for itself. Beckett scoffed, but something in his eyes flickered. Uncertainty, perhaps. Nathan turned and walked away, knowing full well that the battle wasn't over. But he had learned something valuable. He didn't have to fight for a seat at the table. He had already built one of his own. Nathan Carter walked into the lecture hall, his footsteps steady, his expression unreadable. It had been a month since his victory at the National Mathematics Competition, but the echoes of that moment still followed him. Some students looked at him with newfound respect, while others whispered as he passed, still trying to grasp how he had upended the rigid academic hierarchy they had all grown used to. Professor Evelyn Monroe stood at the front of the classroom, her usual commanding presence undiminished, though she never explicitly acknowledged what had happened. The subtle shift in her demeanor was impossible to ignore. She no longer scanned the room as if looking for someone who didn't belong. And when her gaze met Nathan's, it wasn't with the dismissiveness it once held. As Nathan took his seat, Jake Miller leaned in. "You do realize Monroe hasn't called on you once since the competition, right?" he muttered. Nathan smirked. "Maybe she finally realized I know what I'm doing." Jake chuckled. "Or maybe she doesn't want to risk another public humiliation." Nathan didn't respond, but he knew Jake had a point. Monroe's classroom had once been a battlefield where students were expected to prove their worth, and Nathan had done so in a way no one could ignore. But not everyone was willing to accept that. Charles Beckett, the ever-critical professor who had been waiting for Nathan to fail, had grown noticeably colder. He rarely spoke to him, but when he did, his words were clipped, his tone laced with something between resentment and disbelief. One afternoon, as Nathan was packing up his things, Beckett approached. "I see you've become quite the sensation," he said, voice devoid of warmth. "But don't let one competition fool you into thinking you've earned a place among the true intellectuals of this field." Nathan met his gaze, unshaken. "I don't need to be part of any club, Professor," he replied. "I just need the work." Beckett scoffed, but there was no real counter. The work had already spoken. As Nathan left the lecture hall, he knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would always be people like Beckett, those who doubted, those who dismissed, those who clung to old systems of power. But that didn't matter. Nathan had no interest in proving himself to them. He had already proven himself to the only person who truly mattered: himself. Nathan Carter sat quietly at the back of the university library, his notebook open, his pen moving steadily across the page. The familiar silence of the space was comforting, a stark contrast to the weeks of attention he had endured since the National Mathematics Competition. He had won. That was undeniable. But what came after was something he hadn't anticipated. Constant scrutiny, subtle but persistent doubt from those unwilling to accept the reality of his success. Across from him, Jake Miller tapped his fingers on the table, watching as Nathan filled the page with numbers and equations. "You know, people still talk about it," Jake said, keeping his voice low. "The way you beat Ryan Sinclair, how you finished first. It's like they're trying to figure out if it was a fluke." Nathan didn't look up. "It wasn't." Jake smirked. "I know that. But some of them," he nodded toward a group of students whispering a few tables away, "they don't." Nathan exhaled, setting his pen down. He had never sought validation from others, but he couldn't ignore the way their expectations had shifted. Before, they assumed he would fail. Now, they weren't sure what to believe. Even Professor Evelyn Monroe, who had once been his most vocal critic, had stopped challenging him outright. She still pushed him, but there was a difference in her approach. No longer dismissive, no longer waiting for him to stumble. Now, she seemed to be watching, as if trying to understand what had been in front of her all along. Charles Beckett, however, had made no such adjustment. If anything, his hostility had only grown. Nathan noticed in the way Beckett's comments were always aimed just slightly off-mark, designed to undermine him without being outright offensive. In seminars, when Nathan spoke, Beckett would lean back in his chair, arms crossed, barely hiding his disdain. And when Monroe praised Nathan's solutions in class, Beckett's silence was louder than words. One afternoon, as Nathan left the lecture hall, Beckett caught up with him. "I imagine you think you've changed something," he said, his voice calm but sharp. "That one victory has rewritten the rules." Nathan turned to face him, meeting his gaze with steady resolve. "I don't need to change the rules," he replied. "I just need to play the game better than anyone else." Beckett narrowed his eyes but said nothing more. He walked away, leaving Nathan standing alone. But Nathan knew he wasn't alone. He had to work, and that was enough. Nathan Carter sat in the dimly lit university cafe, his coffee untouched, eyes scanning the pages of an advanced mathematics journal. The buzz around him was a mix of laughter, conversations, and the occasional clatter of cups against saucers. Yet, he remained focused, his mind dissecting the complex equations in front of him. Across the table, Jake Miller sipped his espresso, watching his friend with mild amusement. "You do realize the competition is over, right?" he teased. "You already proved your point." Nathan didn't look up. "There's always something more to learn." Jake leaned back in his chair. "You mean, there's always someone waiting for you to fail?" Nathan finally met his gaze. He knew what Jake meant. The victory at the national competition hadn't silenced everyone. Some people still doubted him, still believed he had been lucky rather than skilled. And Charles Beckett was at the forefront of that skepticism. Beckett had always been dismissive of him, but now, after Nathan's success, his comments had become more insidious. In faculty discussions, he questioned Nathan's potential for real academic contribution. In class, he made offhand remarks about how raw talent didn't equate to long-term excellence. Nathan refused to be baited. If Beckett was waiting for him to slip up, he would be waiting a long time. Then there was Evelyn Monroe. She had been his harshest critic, but something had shifted. She still pushed him, still expected the best. But there was a subtle difference. When he spoke in class, she listened. When he presented a complex proof, she nodded rather than dismissing him outright. That change didn't go unnoticed. Some students, once eager to see Nathan fail, had started approaching him for advice. Others still kept their distance, unwilling to acknowledge what had become undeniable. Ryan Sinclair had been silent since the competition. Nathan wasn't sure if it was out of respect or resentment. Either way, he didn't care. As Jake finished his coffee, he leaned forward. "So what now? What's next for Nathan Carter?" Nathan closed his journal and finally took a sip of his coffee. "Now, I keep moving forward. They're expecting me to slow down. I won't." Jake smirked. "Good, because something tells me the story isn't over yet." Nathan simply nodded. He had never cared about proving anyone wrong, only about proving himself right. And that, more than anything, was what kept him going. FSDBF DSN GFMN Nathan Carter walked across the university campus, his mind racing faster than his steps. His name was now more than just a student ID on a university record. It had become a symbol, a statement. The echoes of his victory at the national competition still lingered in the halls, but so did the whispers of those unwilling to accept it. He had seen the looks from Charles Beckett, the professor who had once dismissed him before he even spoke. The same man who, even after Nathan's triumph, still found ways to undermine him in faculty discussions. It was never direct, never outright hostility. It was subtler, wrapped in a language of academia, cloaked in questions about his ability to maintain excellence, or whether his exceptional moment was just that one moment. But Nathan knew better. His success was an accident, and he would prove it again and again if necessary. The weight of his journey wasn't just about solving equations. It was about something bigger, a heartwarming story of perseverance, a battle against the silent walls that had been built long before he arrived. He was part of something greater now, an ongoing chapter in the many emotional stories of those who had fought for their rightful place in spaces where they had once been unwelcome. Evelyn Monroe, once his harshest critic, had begun treating him differently. She still pushed him, still challenged him in ways other students feared. But there was something else in her gaze now: respect. It wasn't spoken, wasn't admitted outright, but it was there. Jake Miller saw it too. You notice how Monroe actually pauses before ripping into your work now. He joked one evening as they studied in the library. Nathan smirked. "She's testing me, seeing if I really belong." Jake leaned back. "And Beckett? What's his excuse?" Nathan exhaled. "He's waiting for me to fail." Jake shook his head. "Then don't give him the satisfaction." This wasn't just about a math competition anymore. It was about justice stories unfolding in real time, about the waves of justice that came crashing down when someone like Nathan refused to be erased. His journey wasn't over. The future was uncertain. But one thing was clear: the fates had been unraveled, and Nathan Carter was here to stay. The story of Nathan Carter is more than just a tale of academic excellence. It is a profound lesson in resilience, dignity, and the power of unwavering self-belief. As we go through life, we often encounter barriers, some visible, others hidden in the expectations and prejudices of those around us. But Nathan's journey teaches us that our worth is not defined by what others believe, but by what we prove through our actions. For many older adults, this story resonates deeply. We have seen a world that is often unjust, where opportunities are not always granted fairly. Yet, like Nathan, we know that true change comes not through resentment but through perseverance. Whether it is standing firm in our values, mentoring the next generation, or continuing to learn and grow despite societal expectations, we, too, have the power to challenge assumptions. Nathan's triumph is a reminder that integrity, intelligence, and determination will always speak louder than prejudice. His story encourages us to reflect. How many times in our own lives have we had to prove that we belong? And how can we use our experiences to inspire those who come after us?